The nature of Microsoft 365 means the security of Entra identities are vital, and any gaps in access management becomes a risk. But just by addressing some fundamentals, you really do protect against most prevalent threats. And so in this episode, Lukas Beran from Microsoft Dart is going to talk me through the big Entra security gaps that he sees in incident response. We'll cover how things like Windows Hello are really underappreciated in terms of their security benefit, and ultimately how you can avoid the kind of mistakes that he helps customers out with in incident response. So let's get going. So from an identity security point of view, what's the most common reason you have to engage with customers? What's the most common reason you see folks getting hacked?
Well, surprisingly, or maybe not, it's still the multi-factor authentication because even though it's getting much better than it was a few years ago, still we usually see a lot of gaps in MFA coverage. And sometimes these gaps are also for privileged accounts. So even administrators or the privileged accounts in the cloud don't have MFA enforced always, all the time for all scenarios, but there are gaps. So sometimes they don't have any MFA at all. Sometimes there are gaps in terms of like some IP addresses are whitelisted, some devices are whitelisted, and so on. And if it's a sophisticated third actor, they usually find a way how to get in, how to bypass these or abuse these whitelisted devices, IP addresses, whatever it is. That's the way how they can get in quite easily. Because if MFA is not enforced, then it's just the username and password, which we all know that it's usually not enough.
It's amazing, isn't it, that we're in, current year, right, 2025, and we're still having the discussion about how MFA
Yes.
is such a recurring gap for folks. But I guess from what it sounds like for you, some of the problem is even if customers on paper they're doing MFA, they think
Yes.
they're covered. There's some gap, and the bad guys are really good at exploiting that. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So when we get engaged, we usually start with these discussions like, okay, what's your MFA coverage? Do you use MFA? What MFA methods you use, and so on. And very often they are very optimistic on their overall security posture. But then when we start digging in and looking for the gaps, we actually find usually a lot of gaps in the MFA coverage. Theoretically, they think that they are fully covered with MFA, but we find a lot of exclusions configured in conditional access policies in Entra ID, for example. And these exclusions are the way how threat actors may get in. And usually the leadership of the organization, or not like the highest leadership, but like the CISO, or the leaders of the IT or security of the organization, they usually think that they are pretty well covered. But in reality, there are, in almost all cases, there are gaps, there are exclusions configured. Some of the exclusions are even temporary or were originally created as temporary exclusions, but eventually became it's permanent
Yeah.
because nobody just changed it back. They created some exclusion for some specific reason for a theoretically limited period of time, but it ended up being a permanent exclusion because nobody has ever removed this exclusion. And this is actually a thing that, for example, privileged identity management can help with. Because if you need to configure something temporarily, such as you need to assign someone temporarily some higher privileges because there is this need, because there is this project, you can do it and make it actually temporary because privileged identity management allows you to configure end date for this role. And after this end date, the user is unable to elevate permissions to this role any longer because it expires automatically. Again, they don't have the licenses sometimes, but the customers that we are working with, they mostly have the licenses that enter IDP too, but they usually, it's not part of their standard processes. They simply put the user to some group and suddenly the user is privileged or the user is excluded from this requirement and that requirement. And then nobody removes this exclusion and that becomes a permanent exclusion.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned privileged identity management, right? Because I think it's such a hidden gem as something to complement conditional access, because you can put that kind of just-in-time principle on an exclusion, like you mentioned, and it's amazing. Like, I work with some enormous companies, and companies who, by all intents and purposes, you would assume have got everything laid down and they've got a lot of resource they can throw at you, but everything is held together with random PowerShell scripts, and there's no proper integration with something like Entra identity governance, right? Or even the parts of identity governance at P2. And it's just such a hidden gem to me, as something that really does control that full life cycle of an exclusion. Because one of the things I always say, it's a kind of butchering of a classic Reagan quote where it's there's nothing as permanent as a temporary exclusion, right? It's like
Yeah.
there's by default that thing is just going to sit there for the next 10 years, and it's quite validating to hear from someone like yourself who works in Dart and in incident response that actually, hey, that does have real world consequences, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And so for example, on one of my recent engagements, this was exactly the thing that happened. So they had a privileged user, and for some weird reasons, this privileged user account couldn't do MFA temporarily. And so they removed the requirement for MFA for this one specific privileged user. And guess what happened? A threat actor abused it because the password was leaked for this specific user, or the threat actor somehow got access to this password or guessed the password and abused the account. And it was a temporary solution. It was MFA was temporarily disabled for this account just for some limited amount of time because of some reasons, but the threat actor almost immediately abused it and got access to the environment with a privileged account and did a lot of mess in the environment. And organizations very often don't realize this risk. They think like, "Hey, if we do it for just a couple of days, what could go wrong, right? What could happen?" But you never know. Even if it's just for a couple of hours, I always say, create some other restrictions. Okay. So if you need to disable MFA for some whatever reason, put some other restriction in place, such as that the account can be used from only this one specific IP address or this one specific device. You can easily configure it by a conditional access policy. That's not a problem at all. But if you remove MFA, create some other boundary, because otherwise you are creating an unnecessary risk. And this is not only for temporary solutions, such as this one example, but we see this also for the permanent solutions or permanent exclusions, permanent whitelistings that are intentionally created as a permanent solution because there is a service account that is unable to do MFA because it's just running somewhere as a service, it's used from some script or whatever, and managed identity cannot be used, or they just didn't create managed identity for that, whatever. And so they whitelist this account from MFA requirements. And they are like, okay, it's just used for this one specific purpose. It cannot be abused because the password is generated. So what could go wrong? I always say, be careful. If it's a service account, it usually doesn't travel all over the world, right? So it doesn't have to be used from all IP addresses on the whole internet. You can limit it to literally one IP address probably, because it's probably running from one specific device, one specific server. So it uses one specific IP address all the time. Why don't you create a conditional access policy and limit the use of this specific account from this one specific IP address?
Love it, love it. Such good advice. It's the whole defense in depth play, right?
Yes,
Insofar as you want to have as many barriers for adversary access as possible, and you want to, if you understand what an account's being used for, you really want to take conditional access and shape it to allow the bare minimum use of that type of account, right? And that's
exactly.
quite validating to hear that from you. It also gets me thinking, like, so one of the common exclusions, if we stick on that theme, I see customers will have, and I think it's an education piece, is they'll maybe say, well, I will exclude users from an MFA requirement if they're on a compliant device or if they're on a
Mhm.
hybrid joined device. And I kind of get the logic, right? They're like, hey, well, if they're on a corporate device, I want to make their life easier. But one thing I know that you produce some content on are things like how Windows Hello for Business and Platform SSO on the Mac, they kind of give you the best of both worlds, right? Where you get that nice smooth experience for your sign on, but you don't have to exclude MFA requirements. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that, those device-based benefits for MFA and conditional access?
Yeah, sure. That's actually very important, and it comes back to the defense in depth, the layered approach that we always should take. Because it was very popular a couple of years ago that we excluded trusted locations, that we excluded compliant devices, or even just high break-churn devices, because we trust those devices, those are our devices. And it was extremely popular. And I remember back then, like 5, 4, 6 years ago, when I was a PFE at Microsoft, so the consultant, technical consultant for large organizations. And it was a big thing because they didn't want to bother all users all the time with MFA. So we would configure things like exclusions for trusted devices, for trusted locations, and so on. It's not recommended any longer because there are ways, and it's not just about that there are ways. It's actually normal, quite normal, that threat actors abuse corporate devices. They deploy some malware because users click on some links, or they abuse some vulnerable software installed on the devices, and so on. And simply put, they can bypass these restrictions because they can get food on compliant devices or use corporate IP addresses that are whitelisted as trusted IP addresses and then effectively bypass the requirement for MFA. And with the technologies that you mentioned, such as Windows Hello for Business or Platform SSO on Mac OS devices, it makes it actually extremely easier, convenient, and secure all the time if you deploy these advanced. I wouldn't even call it advanced. It should be pretty mainstream already. But you deploy this Windows Hello for Business for your Windows devices or Platform SSO for macOS devices. It's extremely convenient for end users because then you can use just your fingerprint or Face ID or PIN and authenticate to your device with something that's considered as multi-factor authentication. Because whenever you use Windows Hello for Business or whenever you use Platform SSO and you use, for example, Touch ID or Face ID to authenticate, it's considered as a multi-factor authentication. So the token that you get consists or contains this claim of successfully authenticated with MFA. So then you can easily enforce MFA from all devices. You don't have to exclude your compliant devices to not bother your users with MFA requirements because every time a user authenticates to the device via Windows Hello for Business or Platform SSO, it automatically contains the claim of satisfied MFA or MFA authentication used, which is then used also, the token is used to authenticate to the cloud services and MFA requirement is satisfied. So users actually never see MFA requirement or on their corporate devices, even though MFA is enforced by conditional access policies.
So on your point then about Windows Hello for Business, you're right. It's not even an advanced configuration at this stage, right? It's a handful of settings in Intune. And one of the cool things is, in addition to getting MFA, like you mentioned, it's phish resistant MFA, right? It's that kind of top tier level of MFA. And one of the selling points to me of Windows Hello for Business is, well, I can get phish resistant MFA at a really, really low cost. Don't have to get FIDO2 keys, don't have to do a big education campaign to teach people how to set up Authenticator. It's just there out the box.
Exactly.
One of the things I know you produce some content on is Platform SSO on the Mac, right? And I'm not a Mac person. I've tried to be a few times. Windows just keeps pulling me back. Maybe on Platform SSO, do you get those same benefits? Like, is it fundamentally phish resistant as well?
Yes, it is phishing resistant as well. So on the background, it technically works almost the same as Windows Hello for Business on Windows devices. So you also use, so for example, on Windows computers, you have TPM, which is used to protect the secrets. On Mac OS devices, you use something that's called Secure Enclave, which is pretty much the same as TPM on Windows devices. You get the key authentication on the background of it. You can use biometric authentication, or users use biometric authentication or can use biometric authentication on their devices. You can use Face ID, you can use Touch ID, whatever you have available. So it has pretty much the same benefits as Windows Hello for Business for Windows users. But you mentioned one very important aspect of it, and it's phishing resistant. So there are only few methods that are considered phishing resistant, and it's the FIDO2 key, which is the hardware key, like a USB device. You can imagine it as a flash drive. It's Windows Hello for Business / Platform SSO, because like I said, on the background, it works almost the same. It's now also Microsoft Authenticator. If you use passkey authentication with the device-bound passkey on your phone, but there are some additional requirements for the operating system version, which for iOS users shouldn't be a big deal because most iOS devices are eligible for upgrades to a higher version of iOS because it needs to be at least iOS 17. This is more struggle for Android users because it needs to be at least Android 14, I believe. And many of the Android vendors don't upgrade their devices to higher versions of Android, so that's a real problem that I have noticed or we were facing many times in the past. But what's so important about phishing-resistant MFA is that that's the highest level of protection for your accounts that you can get in terms of the authentication process. Because standard MFA can be potentially bypassed or abused by phishing links or phishing websites. And it's actually pretty common, and we see it a lot on our engagements. Many of our engagements actually start with phishing. So there is a phishing email, phishing link sent on Teams, phishing link in SMS messages sometimes, and users compromised via these phishing websites where they simply put their credentials. But maybe someone says, okay, so but there is MFA, right? If the threat actor gets the credentials, it's not so big deal for us because we have MFA enforced. But unless it's phishing resistant MFA, the threat actor can easily bypass that as well. Because if it's for example, Evilgenics can do this in real time, they can also trigger the MFA request in live in real time to Microsoft Entra ID and then show it on the phishing website. User confirms it, and they send the response back to Microsoft Entra ID, and then they get a token, access token, refresh token for the user account with MFA satisfied. So it's a real thing. It's not a theoretical threat. It's really happening. And this is why phishing resistant MFA is so important. And this is why many organizations, including us at Microsoft, are moving towards phishing resistant MFA. For example, we internally have disabled all other MFA options, so the push notification or one-time password, let alone SMS or phone call is blocked completely for our MSFT accounts. We have to use phishing-resistant MFA all the time, either on our phones, we didn't mention device-bound passkey, or obviously Windows Hello for Business on our computers.
And I like how you mentioned that the adversary in the middle attacks this requirement for phishing resistant MFA. This isn't theoretical stuff, right? I mean, when I look at the data from some sources like the Digital Defense Report that comes out every year, and I even look at the data that comes out of some of our SOC partners that we work for, and adversary in the middle. Over the years, the last 3 years, but especially the last 2 years, 12 months, it's just kind of this hockey stick diagram of the prevalence of this type of attack because it's so cheap for an adversary to run an adversary in the middle server. Phishing as that initial gotcha, that's such a prevalent threat that is so hard. It's such a cat and mouse game. And I guess, like, to me, the phish resistant MFA, I don't want to call it low hanging fruit because it's simple, but every organization might not find it as easy as every other one. But it's got to be in those kind of, hey, give me a list of 5 things I should do. Phishing resistant MFA, it has to be on everyone's radar, I guess, is the point.
Yeah, totally. And like I said, we see that phishing is still probably one of the most popular attack methods that threat actors use because it's extremely effective. There is still a lot of users that don't have any MFA at all, which is then when the username and password is compromised, it's game over pretty much for the account. But the more users are protected with MFA, the more sophisticated the threat actors also are and use more sophisticated attacks. Because a couple of years ago, any MFA method was pretty much stopping the threat actors. Unless you were really targeted, it was a targeted attack. If it was just the random attack, if you used MFA, it would be probably a no-go for the threat actor. They would simply go somewhere else and try to abuse some other identity that doesn't have MFA. Now, the more users are protected with MFA, the threat actors need to adopt, and they do adopt, and they start abusing also the weaker MFA methods. And here we are talking especially about SMS and phone call as MFA methods, because things like SIM swapping, it's again another very popular technique. And for example, OctoTempest, which is the scattered spider, or OctoTempest is also known as scattered spider, or Def875. They are very popular with SIM swapping. They actually started as the threat actor group that started with just SIM swapping. They sold it to other threat actor groups, and then they naturally evolved to ransomware and other types of attacks. But SIM swapping was the way how this threat actor group was formed originally back in 2022, I believe. So it's SIM swapping is another real thing, and which is the reason why the organizations should move away from this SMS and phone call authentication towards something more secure. And the push notifications are actually quite okay. It's definitely much more secure than one-time passwords or the phone calls or SMS. But on the other hand, phishing resistant is another level, because the standard notification that you get to your application, to Microsoft Authenticator, is not phishing resistant. And many administrators don't realize it because they think, okay, I see the number, I need to put a number to the authentication page, but they don't realize that the phishing authentication page can actually contain the same window. And if it's a real time, so if it's not like offline harvesting of credentials, the threat actor can pass it through to Microsoft Entra ID and finish the authentication for the account, even with this MFA being enforced. So stepping up and going, beyond the standard authentication methods is very important, and it's getting more important over time. Because, like I said, the more organizations move towards standard MFA, threat actors need to adopt, and they adopt because that's their business. So organizations need to move again to more secure ways of authentication. But we talked about the layered approach as well. So the authentication itself that's not the end of the story. Organizations should adopt also other means of protection for their environment, such as, for example, now we have the token protection, right, or token binding, where even if the threat actor tries to steal the token is cryptographically bind to a specific device. So even if the threat actor is able, via, for example, some malware, steal the token from a device, the token is useless for the threat actor. They cannot simply use it on any other device because it's bound to one specific device. So that's another level of protection. Or even for phishing, there are pretty good ways how you can protect yourself from phishing attacks.
It's funny you mentioned the token binding and the fact that phish-resistant MFA protects that first part of the process as far as the issuance of the token. But then you have to think about post-issuance protection of those tokens, right? And we've got the binding of it to the TPM in supported scenarios. And we did a podcast quite recently with Nestor Cinema, security researcher, and he's got some kind of really cool stuff on this topic. And one of the recurring themes that keeps coming up when we talk about that protection of tokens as they exist on the device is the whole BYOD question, right? Insofar as I wrestle with this question all the time, insofar as I'm trying to be as realistic as possible on the basis that for a lot of organizations, BYOD, it just has to exist. The cat is out the bag and it's not going away. But it's really hard to adequately secure BYOD, right, from that point of view. And I'm just wondering, based on your experience in incident response and things, does that kind of theme of BYOD come up in the incidents you get involved with?
Well, interestingly enough, it's not. So BYOD is not a big thing that we would see on our engagements. And the reason probably for that is that so BYOD is a problematic in terms of like data protection, the access of regular users. But that's not a big deal for us because we deal with things like domain admin account compromised or global admin in the cloud compromised and so on. So pretty much a completely different level of threats or different level of compromise of organizations. So BYOD is not a big topic for us. But on the other hand, I completely agree with Dr. Azure AD because BYOD for me is there is no way how you can actually completely secure BYOD devices. It's some kind of balance between, the user experience versus, the cost of, issuing every user their own cell phone or sometimes laptop. But it's always about some gaps that you leave there intentionally that could be potentially abused by someone. But like I said, it's not a big deal for the whole organization security. Obviously, as long as you are not using BYOD devices for your domain admin access, for example, that would be a completely different story. And we don't see that, unfortunately. BYOD devices are pretty much just for end user access. So it's mostly about compliance or potential data exfiltration of some specific user or few users, but not like the whole domain compromise or whole organization takeover or stuff like that. But I totally understand what Dr. Azure AD was saying, and I totally agree with him on this, that if you want to really make your organization secure, you need a full device management and full device protection. BYOD will not give you the same capabilities as full device protection.
Gotcha. And I think that's the way you frame it there is really quite useful insofar as that complete catastrophic organization affecting cybersecurity incident that makes the headlines, that is less likely to occur in the BYOD scenario. But what is more likely to occur will be the, for lack of a better term, maybe like the petty data loss incident, right? Where, hey, someone left the company, but they left all their corporate data on their device and you no longer have access to it. And
Yes.
one of the things that comes up in discussions I have with a lot of clients is they'll raise the question of purview to me. I do tons of work around purview, but before I even start talking to folks about purview for a data security point of view, I want to talk to them about Entra from a data security point of view, because if you aren't securing that identity pane, you can have all the sensitivity labels in the world that you want, but if your users can go away and just download everything onto an unsecured device, that's the bigger question you have to contend with first, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. Because identity is the control plane. I mean, we have been saying that for a couple of years, and this narrative is changing somehow over time. But the identity is still the way how users access their corporate devices, the corporate applications, the corporate data, the services, everything. So it needs to be the first layer of defense, because if you are unable to secure your identities, your users, then what's the point of securing your devices or your data? Because users need access to those devices and access to those data. So if a threat actor is able to compromise a user identity, it means that this threat actor also can get access to the devices, applications, data, and so on, because those are hidden behind the identity that that has been compromised, which then makes it the other defense layers less effective if user identity is not protected adequately enough.
Great point, and it reminds me of like something I seen Matt Zorch tweet recently, where when there's an incident, let's say it makes the news, one of the common questions is, well, why weren't they encrypting the data? And I guess the reality behind that question is, well, they were encrypting the data, but they compromised an identity that had permission to decrypt the data,
Exactly.
right?
If you hold the decryption keys, then the encryption is useless, right? It doesn't help if you are able to decrypt the data. So it comes again back to the identity security. I'm not saying that device security or data protection is not important. It is. It is extremely important. But it's part of some of the layered approach to security, to the multiple levels of defense that we need to accommodate, but it all starts with identity security.
And so I'll tell you what I'd love to do is I'd love to pick your brains about something, going back to our discussion earlier about exclusion management and things like that. It's kind of hard to have a discussion on exclusion management in the identity and conditional access context without bringing up break glass accounts, right? Emergency access,
Yes.
style access. So I mean, you talk about a controversial subject. I feel like every time I go on LinkedIn or Twitter, someone has a new method of managing this or a new opinion, or it's a little bit of a minefield at the minute, right? And my personal opinion is I think a lot of people overthink it. I have my own principles for what I consider to be good break glass. But from your experience, I guess, working with incident response, and then before that, when you were doing consultancy and things like that, what's your kind of general advice for folks managing emergency access accounts in Entra?
Well, first of all, you need break glass accounts created. That's the very first, thing that you need to do, because we still see a lot of organizations that don't have any break glass accounts created. And I've seen it many times. I've actually in the past, back then when I was a PFE, I was contacted by some of our customers in situations where they locked themselves out of the environment because they created like conditional access policy. They didn't, evaluate the impact properly, and they simply locked themselves out of the environment. And they were wondering how they can get access back to the environment. And Microsoft support can help with that, but it's a quite painful process and lengthy process, because obviously Microsoft support needs to verify that you are actually who you pretend to be. You are not a threat actor that's trying to take control over some tenant, customer tenant. So the process is not easy. It takes some time. You need to do a lot of steps to verify yourself, and then the support can help you. But that shouldn't be the way of thinking about it, because you should be prepared for that. You should be prepared that when something like this happens, you have your own way how to solve the issue. And that's the one of the drivers for break glass accounts. Then the other driver is some service issues. For example, if MFA is not working, push notifications are not being sent, or the SMS are not sent because there is some issue with on the Microsoft side. You need to have a way how you can get access to your environment without unnecessary service dependencies, because the traditional methods of authentication, there are some service dependencies. For example, the mentioned MFA, it's push notification, it's a service dependency that may potentially have an outage. The same with SMS or phone calls. There is, again, a service dependency that might be impacted by some technical problems on Microsoft side. And it's not theoretical. We have seen this situation a few times in the past where Microsoft had some outage that affected, for example, multi-factor authentication. And you should be prepared for that. So these are the two main drivers for break glass accounts. And now to the original question on break glass account management. Originally, a few years ago, the recommendation was to have an account with a strong, randomly generated long password. Save the password or print out the password on a paper and put it to like a safe somewhere in your office or something like that. So pretty much having an account that's only password protected, so that you will not face any service dependencies for MFA, for example. But now we are in the process of enrolling mandatory MFA requirements for some of the admin portals, some of the Azure services, and so on. So this recommendation technically shouldn't be used any longer, because if you have a break glass account that's protected only with password and doesn't have any MFA methods even enrolled, then it means that you will not be able to authenticate to some of the admin portals, because of this hard requirement that cannot be bypassed for MFA authentication, which is enforced by Microsoft. So that comes to the current recommendation, which pretty much is along FIDO2 keys or somehow device-bound, passkey authentication. So what I usually recommend is really physical FIDO2 keys. So have a USB device and use this USB device for your break glass accounts. In general, you should have at least two break glass accounts. That's always the recommendations. For larger organizations, you can have maybe even more than two break glass accounts. Have it, for example, one break glass account at one office and another break glass account at another office, for example, and use FIDO2 authentication for these accounts. because FIDO2 authentication, first of all, it satisfies all of the requirements defined by Microsoft for MFA when accessing admin portals. And second of all, it doesn't have any service dependencies. So it's independent on any of the standard MFA authentication options. The only dependency is Entra ID itself. And obviously, if Entra ID is down and you are unable to authenticate at all, then there is no way how you can authenticate in general, and a password or FIDO2 doesn't change anything about it. But there is literally no other dependency. So FIDO2 is the current recommendation. What you should do is, or again, it's my kind of recommendation, but I think it's also pretty much the same, is also recommended by Microsoft as well. So having 2 FIDO2 keys per break glass account, again, stored in different physical locations. And what you also should do is test the account regularly. So you should verify, similarly to, for example, backups, you should verify that this backup option in the form of break glass account actually work. So use the account from time to time to verify that you are actually able to access the admin portals. Log into Azure portal, log into Microsoft 365 admin portal, verify that it works, that you have the access that you need. There is nothing like pending on the account, because sometimes if, for example, change the authentication methods, it might affect this break glass account as well, and you might be prompted to enroll, I don't know, your phone number or your authenticator app, because it's generally required for all accounts in the organization. And that might be the roadblock for you when you actually need to use the account. So verify that you are able to successfully authenticate, and then there is no other requirement in place for break glass accounts. And then obviously, lastly, put this break glass account to, or accounts to, exclusion for all conditional access policies in the environment. And I mean literally all, because you never know what could break, what could happen. So have it a standard part of your processes. Whenever you're creating a conditional access policy, always put your break glass accounts to exclusions, even before you hit the OK button, because the OK button could be the way how you lock yourself out. So have it automatically part of all your conditional access policies during the initial policy creation process.
Such good advice. I guess all of that is good advice. And to the last point you made, it's literally the first thing I do when I set up a policy. Before I even give it a name, I head to
Yes.
users and I hit that exclusion, because you don't know. Hey, you could have just this little kind of your mind could drift away. And
Yeah.
I configured that in a way I
Misdirection,
shouldn't have done that.
something, and
100%, 100%. And I also love the tip on testing it out, right? Because these break glass accounts, when you need to use them, you are going to be in a very stressful situation by the very nature of it. That testing process, I find that I'll hold my own hand up here. People like me who are really good at that architecture point of view, we're good at setting stuff up, but there's an operational point that has to be considered there as well. And I guess that's, well, I mean, you've dealt with a lot of incidents. That's the kind of thing you would have to contend with a lot, I guess.
yeah. One extremely important thing that also comes from my experience is that break glass accounts must be, let's say, technologically independent. What I mean by that I've been on engagements where break glass accounts were created, whitelisted from all conditional access policies and so on. But it turned out that the organization was protecting break glass accounts with like software vaults. So, for example, I remember using a software vault from one vendor. It doesn't matter, and the break glass accounts were protected by the software vault. And the issue that we were facing was that the software vault was unavailable because of the incident. Because, for example, this specific case was the Active Directory was completely down. It was unavailable. All domain controllers were isolated or encrypted or any other way unavailable. And the software vault was integrated with Active Directory. So there was no one who could access the software vault to access the break glass accounts. So it's extremely important to avoid any, and literally any, dependencies. Even the smallest dependencies that you think that it's okay, this could never go wrong, this could never happen. Avoid any technological dependencies on your pre-class accounts and have them really physically just, in some safe in your office, but not integrated with AD, with any of your technological stack, because it can go wrong in case of a cyber incident.
Absolutely. No, such a good point. And you see a lot of, for example, on-premises MFA applications that will be integrated. Folks think, well, hey, my emergency access account, well, I'll use a third-party MFA dependency, right? And that
Yes.
can really catch out. That's solid advice. I need to review a few things now to make sure I got my best practices in order. Okay, well, listen, Lucas, it's been fantastic having you spend some time with me here. I certainly learned a lot, especially when we're talking about great class accounts just there. If folks want to find you online, see your content, get in touch with you, what's the best stuff they should be doing?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the primary platform for me. You can also find me on Blue Sky. I have a YouTube channel. I have my blog. It's called Cybersecurity World. So you can Google me or Bing me or whatever search engine you use. Yeah, I will be happy to connect with you all.
Cool, good stuff.
Thank you for having me, Ru. Have a good day.
Cheers, Lucas.